In this section, we'll look at how the Populist Party was short-lived. Despite its initial success, an economic downturn swept the economy in 1893. Just as 20 years before, in 1873, a speculative bubble, primarily in railroad stocks again, popped, and everybody ran on the banks to get their money out. And this began what people called as the Panic of 1893 or the Depression of 1893. The fact that a government had been issuing more paper currency, which the farmers been demanding, didn't help because everybody ran to the bank and they wanted to redeem their paper currency for gold. The Depression really hurt the average American. It was a heavy human toll. Industrial employment soared somewhere between 20 and 25%, leaving millions of factory workers with no money to feed their families or heat their homes. And a lot of recent immigrants, they arrived and they just immediately faced disaster. Jobless men tramped the streets and rode freight trains from city to city seeking work. And to make matters worse, the winter of 1893-1894 was really harsh and cold. In New York City, where the crisis quickly swamped the local relief agencies, a minister reported there was actually starvation. Rural America wasn't any better. I mean, they'd already had declining agricultural prices, and the prices dropped by even more. Corn plummeted from 50 cents to 21 cents a bushel. Wheat went from 84 cents to 51 cents, and cotton sold for only 5 cents a pound in 1894. The new president, Grover Cleveland, while the only Democrat in the late 19th century, he reacted to the economic downturn in a real conservative type of way. In other words, he reacted against the populist demands for reform. Taxing and regulating businesses, he feared, would slow the hiring and raise unemployment. And boom and bust cycles were inevitable, he argued, and the government couldn't do anything. Cleveland failed to grasp the larger picture, and he focused on a single peripheral issue, defending the gold standard. Now, as the gold reserves dwindled, everybody was running to the banks to get their money redeemed in gold. Cleveland blamed the Sherman-Silver Purchase Act, and in August 1893, he even called on Congress to repeal it. Populists, they were exploded in anger and had a lot of protest, and they demanded more active government assistance for the poor. And with gold continuing to drain from the national treasury, Cleveland eventually had to turn to Wall Street. In early 1895, with the gold reserves down to only just above 40 million, Cleveland turned to bankers J.P. Morgan and August Belmont, who agreed to lend the government $62 million in exchange for bonds at a special discount. Now, with this loan from Wall Street, the government purchased gold to replenish its reserves. Meanwhile, Morgan and Belmont, of course, they resold the bonds for a substantial profit. This complicated deal did help restore confidence in the government's economic stability. The gold drain quickly stopped, and when the Treasury offered $100 million in bonds earlier in 1896, they quickly sold, so people had their confidence back. But, Cleveland had saved the gold standard, but he paid a real high price. His dealings with Morgan and Belmont and the bankers, handsome profits on the deal, confirmed populist suspicions that there was an unholy alliance between Washington and Wall Street. Unable to get any help from Cleveland or the federal government, angry workers and farmers sort of exploded in anger. And the best example of this was the Pullman strike of 1894, where workers of the Pullman Palace Railroad Car Company went on strike. The Pullman Palace Railroad Car Company was in Pullman, Illinois, and named for its owner and founder, George Pullman, who, you would expect, controlled everything in town. And the workers claimed that Pullman wasn't treating everybody fairly. When they went on strike, Cleveland's Attorney General didn't listen to the workers' demands and issued a federal injunction ordering the workers back to work. And when the workers heard about this injunction, they kind of went nuts, and they set the train yard on fire and were overturning trains. A number of railroad workers nationally began to say that they wouldn't run any trains that had Pullman cars on them. And eventually, the federal government called out the National Guard, the military, and violence resulted. About 30 strikers were shot and killed, and over 50 were wounded. At the end of all of this, to try to make up for it, I guess, Cleveland in Congress voted in a new holiday that they called Labor Day. Another example of the worker and farmer anger at the government's lack of help in the 1893 Depression was the so-called Coxey's Army. In Massamillion, Ohio, the self-taught monetary expert Jacob Coxey proposed a solution to unemployment. He wanted a $500 million public works program funded with paper money, not backed by gold, but simply designated legal tender, kind of like it is today, I might add. A man of action as well as ideas, Coxey organized this march on Washington to lobby for his scheme. And along the way, thousands joined him, and several hundred actually reached Washington in late April 1894. Police arrested Coxey and the other leaders when they attempted to enter Capitol grounds, and eventually his quote-unquote army broke up. Although some considered Coxey kind of odd, his proposal closely resembled programs the government would adopt during the Depression of the 1930s. Anyway, the Coxey's Army was, it was another example of this populist anger because the government wasn't helping them in the Depression of 1893. When the 1896 election came along, the Democratic Party sort of recognized the voting power of this outrage, and they decided that maybe they should tap in some of this reform populist outrage. And so they nominated a very young, time 36 years old, two-term congressman and a former journalist, William Jennings Bryan, to be their candidate. And Bryan was a fantastic orator. He was just a great public speaker. And they tried to work in much of the populist demands into their platform. The Populists tried to maintain themselves as a viable third party, but when they too nominated Bryan, it was obvious that the Democrats had sort of taken over. Bryan then made a less restrictive money supply his central focus in the campaign, and being a great orator, he gave a famous speech in July 1896 called the Cross of Gold speech. He said, "Don't crucify me on a cross of gold." Of course, the cross of gold representing the gold standard that he said was killing him. The Democratic Party technically supported all the issues the Populists had called for, but Bryan really went after the farmer vote because the farmers were seen as red, white, and blue, apple pie, nothing more American than that. And the workers, a lot of them were immigrants, and they were striking and were seen as radical. And there'd been some violence, like at the Pullman strike, and so Bryan distanced himself from that. In this cartoon, you can see the Silverite riding the Democratic donkey on the left, and on the right you can see the farmer hurting, and here comes the donkey to help him. In 1896, the Republicans nominated William McKinley, who was a laissez-faire, anti-reform, pro-business guy, and his campaign was also notable because he had a shrewd Ohio industrialist named Mark Hanna running his campaign, and Hanna sought huge donations from business, and he actually raised $3.5 million, which is seemed nothing today when our billion-dollar presidential campaigns, but back then was considered unbelievable. Hanna also said that if Bryan had his way, for silver, then the inflation would be so much it would kill people. In the end, the tactics worked, and McKinley won the election, pretty good margin, and the Republicans also won both houses of Congress. Undoubtedly, the Populists, who technically were trying to still run as a third party, probably drew some votes away from Bryan and the Democrats, but it was clear that McKinley was a choice of the people. After the election, it was also pretty clear that the People's Party, the populist movement, was dead. It wasn't just that the Democrats had kind of stolen their thunder. It was also because there was a lot of internal tension in their populist movement. Think about it. If workers had gotten higher prices for the products they made, who bought those products? The industrial products they made were bought by the farmers. And alternatively, if the farmers had gotten higher wages for their farm produce, who bought that stuff and ate it? But the urban industrial workers. So there was internal tension there. Also, remember that the Populist Party wanted to include blacks, and there's still a lot of racism in the South. And so, the Populist Party had a lot of internal tension there as well. In any event, the Populist Party, People's Party, was dead, and this concludes the section on the demise of the People's and Populist Party.